All right, we're going to go ahead and kick it off. Thank you for joining us this evening. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, the Montana Human Rights Action Network is a not-for-profit, statewide, multi-issue human rights organization. We work to organize and mobilize Montana residents to realize their power to advance justice and equality throughout all of Montana. We leverage research, education, and advocacy to advance inclusive policies and support pro-democracy leaders who will champion safety and opportunity for all Montanans. While we are headquartered in Helena, we have staff in Butte, Bozeman, and the Flathead Valley, as well as 2 staffers in Helena, all of which is Indigenous land. As such, we want to make space to acknowledge that we're participants in and products of systems of settler colonialism, systemic racism, economic exploitation, heteronormativity, and other structures that reinforce white supremacy and other forms of oppression. Our topic this evening is a big one, so we do want to let folks know that topics tonight will refer to and include examples of anti-Semitism, racism, anti-LGBTQ+ bigotry, and this content may be upsetting. So please exercise self-care as we dive into this troubling movement, its consequences for Montana, and what we can do about it together. With that in mind, hello everyone. I'm Dr. Gonzalez-Aller, or Angelina is also fine, the Executive Director of the Montana Human Rights Network. Usually, Research Director Travis McAdam headlines these webinars. He's very popular, but he is on medical leave and taking some much deserved time off to rest and recover, and we're happy to report that his recovery is going well. So you can expect him back starlight center stage for our next webinar. We are joined this evening with 2 fantastic network staff members, Sherilyn DeRees and Sean Rager. Sherilyn, right there, hey Sherilyn, is the communications manager for the Montana Human Rights Network, and she spent 6 years as a staff person for our affiliate, Love Lives here in the Flathead, where she organized numerous community-led events and actions to build a more inclusive and safer Flathead Valley for everyone. Sean Rager is the advocacy lead for the Montana Human Rights Action Network and has years of experience in policy, strategy, and community organizing, and is our resident expert in all things LGBTQ+. So thank you so much for joining us this evening. Before I turn it over to our issue experts, I need to share some norms because we have learned hard lessons about this. First, just so everyone knows, we will be recording the panel, but we're going to turn off recording for Q&A. So if you prefer to ask a question by coming off mute, that's not going to be recorded. We can be fully human together. We do ask that throughout the webinar, you submit your questions through the Q&A feature. We will log those. We're going to circle back to them at the end of the session. And lastly, this is your one and only warning. We will have to remove folks from the session if they are interfering with the panelists' ability to respond or affecting the learning experience of others. And we have had to bump folks in the past, and we will do it again. So there will be no harmful language, there will be no homophobia in the chats or the questions whatsoever. We are on our best behavior. We are here to learn together. So with that in mind, I am gonna turn it over to Sherilyn.
Hey everyone, just a couple quick other housekeeping things. If you want to drop in information, you can go ahead and drop that in the chat in the bottom, but if you have a question, please put it in the Q&A. Someone will be monitoring that. We do usually ask people to keep the chat quiet. I've been in some presentations where people are having like a total side discussion in the chat, and we would prefer not to have that going on because it's distracting. However, if you're experiencing technical difficulties, or if we throw down an acronym that you don't understand, please just go ahead and throw it in either the chat or the Q&A, depending on if it's a question or if it's a comment, and we will address it as quickly as we can, especially if it's a technical issue. We want to get that resolved for you as quickly as possible. So thank you so much for being part of this webinar, which is The Call is Coming from Inside the House, Extremism in the 2023 Legislative Session. It sounds very scary, but we're going to tell you we're going to present some hope for you tonight. 2 years ago, many of us were approaching the 2021 legislative session with massive uncertainty. The pandemic had changed our lives. Long held procedures were being changed day by day. Our lives were upended, and the election results really had us wary about what was ahead. Now we know that our anxiety was justified. Legislators during the 21 session used their positions to pass harmful legislation and amplify misinformation about the LGBTQ community, undermine Indigenous sovereignty, and chip away at so many essential rights, including reproductive rights. The 2023 session doesn't look any easier, I'm going to be honest, but I feel like this time we are more prepared for what lies ahead. We know that extremists are stacking up bills to try to undermine LGBTQ rights, voting rights, free and fair elections, Indigenous sovereignty, reproductive rights, and even the Montana Constitution. It's going to be really difficult and overwhelming at times, but we are working with some really smart and talented allied organizations to create strategies to block bad bills, push forward legislation that Montana actually needs, and keep focusing on shared community values that make Montana stronger. We are likely to have some big losses, but we're also planning on some crucial wins. So we're playing the long game, and we'd love to have you on our team. So thank you so much for being willing to join us for this webinar and the upcoming session so we can have the best outcomes possible. The issues, we're going to be focusing on several issues at MHRN, but our main issues are targets that we know that extremists have. MHRN has been following and researching extremism for more than 30 years, and we know what is top of mind for these folks right now in this moment. While we don't have exact bill language yet, and that probably won't be available until the beginning of the session and as some bills roll out, we are seeing a lot of bill drafts, and some are very concerning. So again, here are our core issues. It's LGBTQ rights, Indigenous sovereignty, and constitutional rights. I'm going to start off with constitutional rights. There are many basic rights and checks and balances that extremists would like to remove now that the GOP has a supermajority. With this 2/3 majority, Republicans have the margins across the legislature to create constitutional amendments and then send them to the ballot. So not to approve them themselves, but send them to the ballot without the support of the minority party, the Democrats. But that's if all of the Republicans vote together. Can you advance to the next slide? Thank you. There are many rights that could be under attack this session. For instance, censorship of books. That is an infringement on the freedom to access information, which is protected under the freedom of speech. As you'll see later in the program, some legislators are determined to limit voting rights and some parts of voting like absentee ballots and so on. Our biggest concern this year, though, is the right to privacy. So as you can see in this slide, at the top there, it says Section 10, right to privacy. That's literally the privacy clause from the Montana Constitution. And Montana has some of the strongest protections for privacy of any state in the nation. If extremists can destroy the right to privacy, then they can also take away the right to privacy for medical care. And that includes birth control, abortion, and gender affirming care. In the second little headline that you see that, Attorney General Austin Knudsen is actively trying to destroy privacy. He went to the Montana Supreme Court and tried to tell them that they wrongly decided the Armstrong case in 1997, and that case established the right to abortion in Montana. But as you can see from the last part, Montanans love privacy. And so Constitutional Amendment 48, which was on the ballot in November, this protected digital privacy passed by a huge margin on the November ballot. As we learned from the US Supreme Court's comments when they decided to overturn Roe versus Wade this year, the removal of privacy can also take away protections for marriage equality, other rights for LGBTQ people, even interracial marriage. And so the consequences are very serious, and we are watching carefully to see what extremists are going to try to do to take away privacy. The next area that we're looking at is Indigenous sovereignty. We want to be very clear that the experts on Indigenous sovereignty are Western Native Voice, legislators in the American Indian Caucus, and tribal councils, and Native American councils, and we take our direction from them. The reason that we keep tabs on this is because we follow extremist groups that are trying to attack Indigenous sovereignty, like SARA, which is the Citizens Equal Rights Alliance. And they have a long history of attacking or undermining essential rights for Indigenous people, destroying treaties, and so on. And so some of the issues, and so the long history of betrayal and genocide for the Indigenous people just needs to stop, but yet we keep seeing these attacks. So here are some of the issues that we are looking for and that we've seen in the past. So the first one is voting rights. Seems like every single session, some bill comes up that attempts to undermine the voting rights and the ease of voting for Indigenous people. And in the 2021 session, legislators passed bills that removed same-day voter registration and voting, same-day voter registration, which was been very popular, restrict absentee ballots, restrict absentee ballot collection, removing polling locations or reducing hours, and more. Fortunately, a lot of the voter suppression legislation that was passed in 2021 was overturned before the November 22 election, but we know that similar bills could pop up in this session because that's just the way this is played, is even if a law or a bill is overturned in the courts, somehow someone tries it again. Hunting rights are also one of the rights we're keeping an eye on. And while that may not seem like an obvious way to undermine Indigenous sovereignty, laws that remove the right of sovereign nations to manage activity on their land can lead people to disregard treaty rights and Indigenous rights overall. In 2021, Representative Joe Reed from Ronan introduced House Bill 241, which would have allowed big game hunting on land owned by non-Native people within the reservation. Now, this happens because of the Dawes Act of 1887, which some of you are familiar with, which checkerboarded land within Native American reservations. And what I mean by that is parcels were given out, and like every other one was tribal land or and then private land, and then Indigenous land and non-Native land. And so that just led to a weakening or tensions within people, neighbors, and so on. And so representatives from Native nations across Montana turned out in huge numbers for this hearing because they understood the impact of this bill that on hunting rights that would undermine their sovereignty. So another one that we're looking at is taxation. Some legislators have tried to undermine or challenge or push against the authority of Indigenous people by interfering with taxation. So in 2021, a bill was introduced to reduce tax exemptions for private land that was being reclaimed and added to Native trust lands. So in other words, like in this checkerboard situation, if an Indigenous nation got the chance to purchase some of that private land and add it back into their trust land, that would go through a process, and during the process, they would be exempt from taxes on that land. Well, this bill that passed changed that so then it became more expensive for Indigenous councils to add land back that had been stolen from them in the first place. And this is all of part of the taxation element too. Has to do with this myth that some people believe that Indigenous people do not pay taxes, which is completely false. And so again, that's one of the things that we're looking at. Our third area is LGBTQ rights. And for that, I am going to toss that off over to Sean Rager, my coworker.
Hello. So as Sherilyn was saying, many of the bad bills that we saw during the last legislative session were targeted at the LGBTQ community as a whole, and more specifically trans and non-binary and two-spirit community members and young folks. And so we are very lucky in the state of Montana because in the state of Montana, there is good transparency requirements around the state legislature and the bill drafting process, which means that anytime a legislator requests a bill to be drafted, that request then becomes public information and anyone can see the correspondence between the bill drafter and the bill requester, whoever may become the bill sponsor, any amendments that they start to draft. So that gives us a little bit of an idea of what we may be facing going into a legislative session. And so we can see already that they are preparing a slate of very hateful bills. And this gives us the opportunity to plan how we're going to respond and how we're going to clap back against those. Before we start talking about any of the bills that we're seeing, just a quick reminder for you all about the 3 impacts of policy. As a reminder, those impacts are the impact of the policy itself. So for example, some youth not being able to play sports with their peers because they are transgender. The impact of the rhetoric and misinformation around a bill. So that can be increased instances of discrimination, even violence. It can also be opportunities for more public education around certain issues. And then the final impact is the internalized impact to community members. So in this instance, it may result in some people feeling like they can't participate in any extracurricular activities, may lead to feelings of insecurity and being unsafe, and of course, feelings of being under attack and unwelcome in the state of Montana. So with each of these individual impacts, there is a different way to respond. So really, when we're thinking about how we win this legislative session, we're not just thinking about how we prevent bad policies from passing or going into effect. We think about how to provide more community education, provide more acceptance to LGBTQ community members, and then also provide good community building support, from support groups to having big turnouts at legislative hearings. All of these send a more clear message that counter those 3 impacts of the policy. So this moves us on to talking about extremist goals. Really, what are extreme legislators, extremists trying to do, and really anti-LGBTQ and hate groups trying to do with these policies? And the first of those is that they're trying to keep LGBTQ people out of Montana. And they can do this a number of different ways. And specifically, they're looking at doing it 2 ways. First and foremost, they're looking to make queer folks that live in Montana feel unsafe, feel unwelcome, have their rights in jeopardy. This includes not just LGBTQ adults, but also families with young folks who are LGBTQ and specifically trans, non-binary, and two-spirit. And so by creating those limitations and creating those feelings of unease, makes it significantly more likely that LGBTQ folks will move out of the state. In addition to that, it also prevents LGBTQ folks from moving into the state of Montana, which is really ironic because, the state is trying to promote this move back to Montana, come home to Montana campaign. And the reality is that the messaging is come back to Montana only if you are white, Republican, and share our values. The next impact that they are trying to do is they're really trying to push back against growing acceptance of LGBTQ folks and LGBTQ rights. And we can see this in a number of ways, but this is especially true for LGBTQ youth. And what we know is that when people have community members or family or friends who are queer or trans, non-binary, or two-spirit, really what we know is that they're significantly more likely to be accepting of LGBTQ rights on any number of issues. And so by pushing LGBTQ Montanans out of the state, and by creating a lot of rhetoric that makes people feel unsafe, then it allows this information gap and makes it so that queer people feel less safe coming out and sharing their stories. And that information gap can then be filled in with misinformation and harmful rhetoric. And that's really how they push back against the growing acceptance of LGBTQ issues. Finally, one of the big things that they like to do is they like to turn LGBTQ rights into wedge issues to drive out conservative voters. And a good example of this is if we think of trans sports bans. Now, many of us value very deeply women's sports and everything that the creation of Title IX and specific protections for women's sports has been able to achieve. However, by taking trans women and using trans women's participation in sports, they're able to create a wedge between progressives who really value sports and want to prioritize the rights of women to be able to have equal access to all of the same values and all of the benefits that come with sports. What it turns into is a wedge of misinformation for people who aren't aware of what it actually means for trans women to be able to participate in sports. And it creates an area or an issue where conservative voters are much more likely to turn out. And finally, really the extremist goal is just to make queer, trans, and non-binary people feel like shit. And this leads into every single one of those issues. A demoralized LGBTQ community leads to people leaving the state, makes it easier for people to push back against acceptance of LGBTQ issues, and makes it easier to create a wedge on those other issues. But what we know about these extremist goals is really what they're doing is creating a slate of hate. And specifically what I mean is all of these goals are fed by using rhetoric and policy to other LGBTQ people as much as possible in every single area on every single issue. It's not about the individual issues, it's about all of the issues as a whole and what they're trying to do to the LGBTQ community and the queer community. What we know is that these are fed by big national anti-LGBTQ orgs. And in fact, the specific bill language that appeared in many of the anti-LGBTQ bills from the last session were direct were direct copies from bills that appeared in other states and were promoted by anti-LGBTQ organizations. The other thing that's interesting to note is if we go back and we look at each one of these different motivations, there is a lot of overlap between what they are trying to do with LGBTQ Montanans and what they're trying to do with BIPOC Montanans and what they're trying to do on other conservative issues, where really the goal is to other people as much as possible, take away their rights as much as possible, silence them as much as possible, and use that to drive out their base and have a more white, more straight, and more conservative population in the state of Montana. So at this point, we're going to talk about some of the specifics. And specifically what I mean by the specifics is talking about the bill drafts that we have already seen. So as I mentioned, Montana has a big open policy where any bill that is requested can be seen as soon as it is received by the bill drafters. And so we have seen two very specific bills that have come up. And those two bills are to prohibit transgender surgery on minors. And this was brought forward by Keith Regier, who is in this picture. And then we also have prohibit minors from attending drag shows. And those are just the titles of the bill. The prohibit minors from attending drag shows, just a quick note, was requested by Braxton Mitchell, who can be seen in this picture trying to make himself look cool with a gun. And what we know is that Braxton Mitchell actually ran as a candidate with America First values. And the America First organization, interestingly, has ties back to Nazi Germany and was helped along by literal Nazis during Hitler's rule. And so we can see that these legislators aren't actually representative of many of the populations and the majority of the values of the state. They're extremist representatives. And we're going to talk a little bit more about them when we get to our gallery of villains. But along with specific bills, we also have general bills. And the reason that generals is in quotations is because most of these bills don't have specific names that allows us to know exactly what they are intending on doing. However, based on who proposes the bill, the general name of the bill, and the information that is included in it, it gives us a pretty good idea of some of the intentions that they will have. And so there are a number of bills that we see that we just won't know for sure what they are until they get introduced or until we actually have the language for them. But all of the general bills kind of fall into these three categories. We've seen a lot of bills that will interfere with healthcare, and that can be everything from accessing gender-affirming care for minors, a similar bill to what Keith Regier proposed that has a more specific title. We can also see broader versions of that where they try and prevent all gender-affirming care from being accessible to anyone under the age of 18. And then in addition to that, we can see them trying to remove coverage and prevent insurance companies and Medicaid from covering what is considered medically necessary care and gender-affirming care. In addition to that, in education, we're seeing a lot of bills framed around parental rights. And it's really interesting that they use language around parental rights, because really what they're talking about when they're talking about parental rights is they are asking the government to create rules and regulations according to their values and really create book bans and create censorship in certain ways so that they get the government to parent their children for them. But the ultimate thing is that this comes at the rights of other parents to be able to say, yes, I want my children to be able to access this information at school. I want my children to have medically relevant information to who they are and how they live in the world. But a lot of the education bills that we see kind of revolve around these three different areas. We could see some don't say gay or trans bills, which would limit access to information. We could see some book bans, and we can see some bills that we believe will censor teachers and the information that they are able to provide. Now, it goes without saying that all of these bills are really harmful. And the reality is that by removing all existence of LGBTQ people doesn't actually benefit anyone. And removing the existence of LGBTQ people, even for individuals who are straight and grow up in conservative households and will not ever identify as LGBTQ or will likely not even have relationships or share values with LGBTQ individuals. The reality is, by removing all of that, it also prevents people from being able to learn how to exist in a society with people that have different values from them. So then the last section of bills are kind of accumulation of what I like to call the beyond bills. And those go beyond what we would consider typical decency. All of these are beyond typical decency, but these ones are particularly aggressive and particularly harmful. And those bills, again, we don't know specifically what they may be. However, we see trends and are tracking bill titles that may include things like classifying any LGBTQ related material as obscene. So consider that for a minute, where you're actually saying that someone's identity is inappropriate for other people to be able to encounter. In addition to that, we see laws related to changing legal names that may try and create additional barriers for trans, non-binary, and two-spirit folks to be able to legally update their names. And then in addition to that, we see other bills that get at the heart of the legal challenges that have been used to overturn some of the bad bills from last session. And those are things like altering the authority of the Board of Regents and limiting the judges. But just one final note is that a lot of these are that when you look at them in the legislative on the legislative website, a lot of them say that these are general bills. And so it may say something like generally revise education or generally revise curriculum standards. So it's also possible that a lot of these bills actually have nothing to do with LGBTQ issues, but considering the titles of the bills, where they are coming from, and the actions of legislators in the past. For example, John Fuller, who is in this picture right here, has brought forward a number of anti-LGBTQ bills before. So when we see a general bill from him about education, when he doesn't necessarily have many other bills related to any sort of education topics, gives us a pretty good idea that that might be related. Now, all of this to say, all of these bills that I've discussed have not been introduced yet, and it's possible that none of them will be introduced. However, we think that given the makeup of the legislative session, how the last session went, and the bad behavior of some of these extremist legislators, we can expect to see at least some of these bills. So at this point, you might be thinking to yourself, well, that all sounds pretty terrible. And the reality is, yes, it is. However, it doesn't stop there, because the reality is we can win. And specifically, when we think about how we win, we go back to those three impacts of policy. And with each one of those impacts of policy, whether it be from preventing something from passing, whether it be countering negative rhetoric, or whether it be showing strong support for the community, every single one of those, the way that we win is we turn out and we share our joy that we have in ourselves as LGBTQ community members, and we share the love that we have from community for the LGBTQ community, and we turn out in massive numbers. And every single one of those ways prevents them from being able to win. Because part of the other thing is, last legislative session, because of COVID, there weren't many people in the building. And in fact, before there was a vaccine that was widely available and there was no mask or distancing requirements in the legislative building, in the Capitol building. And so as a result, we believed that it was important for people to actively stay out of the building. And so these legislators have not had a session where they have had both a slate of anti-LGBTQ bills and people in person actually telling them how horrible they are, and the community actually turning up in mass to support queer community members. Okay, so, excuse me. Let's talk about other things and the way that we generally fight back against these bills. When I talk about turning out, I'm talking about us doing more community building events. That includes support groups and decompression sessions after difficult hearings and difficult votes. It includes turning out community members, and it includes turning out to rallies. And then specifically what that looks like, things that we already have planned right now, is LGBTQ Lobby Day. So everyone mark your calendars for February 20th. That is President's Day. So hopefully many of you also have that day off. It is also a day that the legislature meets. And so it's a great opportunity to bring a bunch of LGBTQ community members together. We'll teach you how to talk to your legislators, how to find them in the building. And then we will break up into individual groups so that you're able to find your legislators and talk to them with a group. In addition to that, we have specific involvement groups that we're going to have. So if you are a parent of an LGBTQ community member, if you are a healthcare provider, if you're an educator, or you're involved in a business, there are all very specific ways for you to get involved this legislative session. And then finally, the last way to get involved is as a volunteer.
Sean, was that all you had? Okay, great. Just checking on our slides and so on. Next up, we're going to talk about the gallery of villains that's in the Montana legislature. Now, these are the people who are connected with extremist groups and extremist individuals and causing a lot of trouble across Montana. One thing that I want to say before we talk about specific folks is that we need to be careful that we don't waste a lot of time focusing our energy on these individual people. What's more important is that we engage with the communities and on the issues that need our support. Too often, it's easy to attach ourselves to a villain and think we're going to get somewhere by fighting with them. And it's really important that we focus instead on supporting the bills and the people who need it the most. And so, please keep with these villains, if they are on committees or if they're your legislators, please write them, but please don't spend a ton of time trying to change their minds, because they probably won't, but still do reach out, because they need to hear that people don't agree with them. So first up is, which is going to be no surprise for anyone, ta-da, Senator Teresa Manzella. Teresa Manzella, you can see all of the list of things that we have on this individual image. And the reason that she's first is just because she is involved in almost every extremist group you can think of. She strongly supports anti-government and pro-militia groups that believe the federal government is not legitimate. And she wants to place more power in the hands of local and county governments. And while that may sound good, the problem is that she denies the authority of the federal government, and it concentrates power in the hands of a very few people, and people who may have very harmful prejudices and support discrimination. Teresa Manzella also isn't shy about hanging out with violent extremists like Ammon Bundy and Matt Shea, who have visited Montana repeatedly, and she's showed up at several in-person events with them. She's also completely in on multiple conspiracy theories, including ones that undermine free and fair elections. I mean, she's promoted multiple conspiracy theories over the years. Her big one right now is attacking free and fair elections. Right now, she has more than 30 bill drafts just on election issues. And so, scrolling through the entire list, she wants to reduce access to absentee ballots by just limiting it to military members and people who live overseas. She wants to reduce polling locations. She wants to change the way we count votes and count ballots, and it would just completely create chaos and upend some of our tried and true processes for counting ballots and for maintaining safe and secure elections. And she also has been, she pulled a really terrible one. In 2021, she was on the Senate Judiciary Committee, and she made a statement that was misinformation about LGBTQ people. And then when the same bill came to a House vote, she said, as we learned in the Judiciary Committee, and she didn't learn, she was referring to her own statement. So she does things like this to try to dig for information, spread misinformation. It's really harmful. Next up is John Fuller. And John Fuller is in the Flathead Valley. He was part of 3 anti-LGBTQ bills in 2021, what Sean mentioned before, which is the bill banning trans youth from participating in school sports. There was a bill restricting healthcare, and now I'm blanking on the other one. But he also supports censorship of books up in the Flathead Valley at the Imagine-If libraries. He spoke in support of banning the book Genderqueer when it faced a challenge at the Imagine-If libraries. One of his bill drafts right now is titled Provide for a Youth Protection Act. This has echoes of his Save Women's Sports Act in 2021. That was HB 112, which restricted trans youth from being in school sports. And so what we know from that is, from the 2021, is that just as Senator-elect Fuller is not interested in supporting women's sports, this Youth Protection Act is that he's likely not really interested in supporting youth. He's just using a name to try to get support for something that will actually harm youth in Montana. And we're guessing that if that's the case, that it also is likely a bill that is being pushed by national anti-LGBTQ organizations. And then the next one isn't just one person, it's 3 people. It's the Regier family. It seems unbelievable. Can we have the next slide, please? That 3 members of the same family can serve at the legislature at the same time, but here we are for the 2nd session in a row. We have the Regier 3-pack. All 3 Regier family members received a 0 approval rating on our 2021 legislative scorecard, which means that they voted the complete opposite way that we recommended for the bills that we follow. All of them oppose LGBTQ rights and reproductive rights. The father, Keith, who's in the center, he's a senator, and he repeated misinformation, as Sean said, during the Senate Judiciary Committee hearings. Matt, who is on the right, is now Speaker of the House, and he has spoken in favor of turning nonpartisan judicial races into partisan races. If any of you followed the race of Ingrid Gustafson and James Brown, you saw how toxic it gets when nonpartisan races become a partisan battleground. But that's what Matt Regier was recommending. And his sister Amy, who's on the left, is now chair of the House Judiciary Committee, where many LGBTQ plus and reproductive rights bills start their process to become a law. And she's already introduced some bill drafts that seem to be against abortion rights. And speaking of how bills become laws, Sean is going to explain all that to us.
Okay, so I mentioned earlier that bills start in the drafting phase, and any legislator or legislative committee can request a bill to be drafted. Once that bill is drafted, it goes back and forth between the drafter, the requester, and whomever may become the sponsor of that bill. It goes through a couple of review processes, which may include a legal review, and it may also go through a fiscal review if there's a belief that there will be a cost associated with the bill. Then, if the sponsor of the bill is in the House of Republicans, it will get introduced in the House of If the sponsor of the bill is in the House of Representatives, it will get introduced in the House, at which point it gets assigned to a committee. Now, the committee will hear the bill and will have a hearing that is open for public comment. It is as a requirement of the state of Montana that bills that are introduced get hearings to allow for public comment. After there's a public comment, that committee will take what's called executive action, where they may vote to pass the bill to the floor. They may vote to amend the bill, or they may vote to table the bill, which means that they're essentially setting it aside and will likely not do more work on the bill. If a vote is amended and then it will get a second vote to determine whether or not it will pass to the floor as amended. If something does get passed onto the floor, that means that every representative or every senator will hear the contents of the bill. And then they get an opportunity to discuss that bill only amongst each other. So that means that we will work with a lot of our allies in the House and in the Senate to talk about different issues that are important to us associated with various bills. Then after that debate happens, there's an opportunity for amendments to be added on, and then it goes up for what's called second reading. And that second reading involves a vote. And everyone in the House or in the Senate votes on whether they think the bill should pass. For a bill to pass second reading, it has to have more than half of the votes, meaning that if there are 100 representatives present that day in the House, 51 of them have to vote for the bill to pass. For it to stall and not pass, you just need half of them, meaning 50, to not vote for it. Then the next day, it goes to a third reading, which is kind of a final or confirmation vote. After that, it goes to the opposite chamber and goes through a very similar process. And then once it goes through both chambers, if it passes in both chambers, it's signed or vetoed by the governor, and then becomes law or not if it's vetoed by the governor. Now, the important thing to know is that this creates many opportunities for us to be able to prevent bad bills from passing. So, for example, if we're able to not get it to pass out of committee, if we're able to stop it on the floor in either the second or the third reading, or if we're able to, by some miracle, get a governor to veto a bill, and specifically I'm talking about our current governor to veto a bad bill, then it essentially dies. So that's kind of how a bill becomes a law, and that will be helpful going into this next session where we talk about the results of this past election, the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good news is that for the first time, we will have 2 legislators who are trans and non-binary, and those folks are S.J. Howell and Zoe Zephyr. And we at the network have worked for a long time with Howell. We're really excited that they're going to be in the legislature. And some of you may recognize Zoe's name because we partnered with Zoe during the last legislative session, and she worked and shared her story as an athlete and as a trans person, and was able to talk about her experiences. So we're really excited about both of them. In addition to that, LR 131, which was an anti-abortion ballot initiative, legislative referendum, did not pass. Additionally, Ingrid Gustafson was elected to the Supreme Court, and Ingrid has a great history on reproductive health issues and on LGBTQ issues. And then finally, the last thing that we're celebrating is Brad Cheetah, who was a legislator out of Missoula, who would have made our House of Villains if he would have been elected, did not because he was defeated. Okay, let's talk about the bad. The bad news is that Democrats lost a combined total of 5 seats in the House and the Senate. So we have some work to do. And then in addition to that, on the ugly, we know that many extremists won re-election or were elected for the first time. So let's talk about some specifics about what things mean and what these numbers look like. In the House, there's 100 total seats. Of those 100 seats, 68 of them are Republicans, which means for us to get to 50-50, we need 18 Republicans and all 32 Democrats to vote against something to prevent it from passing. To get something to pass, that means we need 19 Republicans and 32 Democrats to vote to get something to pass. On the Senate side, there are 50 seats, and 32 of them are held by Republicans, 16 of them are held by Democrats, which means we need 9 Republican votes to kill a bill. And then in the individual committees, what we know is that on the House, so in both the House and the Senate, LGBTQ bills that we expect to see are most likely to get referred to the Judiciary Committees and the Education Committees. In the House, on the House Judiciary side, we need 4 of 13 Republicans and all the Democrats on the committee to vote no in order to prevent something from passing. In the House Education, we only need 3 of 9 Republicans to vote no to prevent something from passing. And then things are looking a little bit easier on the Senate side. In Senate Judiciary, we only need 2 of 7 Republicans to vote no. And on the Education Committee, we only need 2 of 7 Republicans to vote no to prevent something from passing. And I'm going to turn it back over to Sherilyn.
So we're going to wrap up the webinar. Thank you all for sticking with us. A lot of information that we threw at you, and I know a lot of it is tough information. So we're going to wrap up with what you can actually do. And so the first thing you can do is reach out to legislators personally. We are very lucky in Montana because the government is close to the people. Well, many of you see some of your legislators in the grocery store or coffee shops or hardware stores. They're around and they're accessible. So even if you disagree with them, please make sure you reach out. If you have a personal relationship or connection with them, please reach out to them even before the session, because a lot of legislators really get nailed with a lot of comments during the session, but don't hear from people before or after. So now is a good time to reach out and tell them politely, hey, these are some of the issues I care about. And I hope you understand that. The second thing you can do is choose issues wisely. It's really last legislative session, we put out an action list every week about here are things that you can comment on, and it's overwhelming. And we know that a lot of people kind of burned out or got overwhelmed partway through the session. And so what we're suggesting that people do this time is just pick a few issues that you care the most about and follow them. Because as Sean explained, earlier about how a bill becomes a law, you don't just send an email once to a legislator to tell them you care about it. At every stage in the process, it's important to engage and to tell your legislator that you care, because, votes can turn. We have seen multiple votes turn on the last reading. And so we need to make sure that the pressure stays on all the way through. Call or email. I have to tell you, I don't know how the legislature does it, but they have the friendliest people on the switchboard ever. And making a call is like very easy, and they make it super easy to do. Or email legislators every week. What we're asking people to do is not make the legislative session consume your lives. That's our job. We're just asking, we can make a big difference if a few more people engage a little bit more. And so what we're asking people to do is write 2 to 3 emails a week. And those emails can just be 2 or 3 sentences long. They don't have to be this huge missive that is going to convince people. If you have a expertise in an area, or if you have a very important personal story, then please write longer than that. But really, a lot of legislators just want to count, they're just counting up the yeses or the no or the support or oppose from their constituents. One note on making comments is that all comments are considered public information. And so we suggest that you do not put a lot of personal information in those comments. So for example, and the reason is because we've seen in other states that people can search through those and maybe look to target certain people based on their public comments. So for example, if you're the parent or close relative of a transgender person, you can say, I care about this issue because I have a family member who is transgender and I have seen all of the issues they have faced during their transition. I would caution you about saying I have a transgender child and naming that child. Because again, we want to protect people as much as possible. And then can we go back a slide, please? And then the last thing is, you do not have to focus on the session. Make sure that you're enjoying your life, you're connecting with friends, and you're making positive memories during the session. Last session was very hard on a lot of us because during the pandemic, we couldn't meet together and we had to stay at our homes. A lot of us felt very lonely and isolated behind our computers. Please do positive things to release the stress and connect with folks. And so one of the ways that you can, now next slide, make sure that you're getting information is you can sign up for our legislative updates. Carissa just put in the chat the link for our legislative session. You can get updates on everything. You can get updates on just a few issues, but if you sign up for that, then we can get you the updates that you need, because we really, not only do we need you to engage, but we want to make sure that we're getting you the information that you need so that we can make a stronger, safer, and just a better Montana, where everyone's rights are respected and protected. So with that, you can also get our general email updates, and you can send an email to network@mhrn.org, and that way you'll get emails about everything that we do, our events, our action items that are not just about the legislature, and that way we can stay connected to you. So now that wraps up the main part of the webinar, and we are ready to take Q&A. You all have been asking some really great questions, and so if you have any more, please feel free to ask those now.
Yeah, and right before we head into Q&A, I just wanted to share that a lot of these successes that we spoke about this evening, killing a bill on the third reading, bringing down the bathroom bill, these are the direct result of the involvement of actions of people like you. Actually, it probably was a lot of you. If you're showing up for this webinar, we imagine that you have already been a part of this movement. And so with that said, if you've learned anything tonight, it's that we're going to need to call on you again this next legislative session, because the future of Montana is not yet written, and it's going to be your courage, your perseverance, and your commitment to stand with our friends, family, neighbors that ultimately writes that next chapter and the future of Montana. We are up against incredibly challenging odds. We all saw those slides about the House and Senate. So we're going to need resilience, community, and solidarity more than ever. When we release the recording of this webinar, which we will, it might take us a little while to get it up. It's the end of the year. It's a busy time, but we promise we will get it up there. Please share it with your friends, share it with your colleagues, your family, your neighbors. And if you're not a member of the network, please consider becoming a member today. It's the support of our members and especially our monthly donors that are so instrumental in keeping the fight for human rights nimble, fueled, and fired up. So we really appreciate your support. We appreciate you spending your Wednesday with us this evening. We know it's a busy time of the year for everyone, and we're excited to get into some Q&A.